Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Yoliswa Makasi. I am the head for Public Service Reform Program at the New South Institute, and I will be taking you through the program for today for our webinar. The New South Institute has convened this webinar. Firstly, just 2025 has really been a defining year for migration across Africa. And today we bring that journey to a close with a critical conversation on mobility and regional institutions. From free movement to migration, governance, and continental integration, today's discussions connects cutting-edge New South Institute research with real policy impact. We have Mr. Alan Hirsch, who is our lead program lead in terms of this particular work, and he will be taking us through in detail in terms of the work that has been done. Just briefly on the 3 papers that the NSI has released in terms of this particular work. The first paper looks at continental mobility, AU Free Movement Protocol, and AFCTA. This paper was written by Alan Hirsch and Amadi, and the report really looks at Africa's big continental initiatives, the AU Free Movement of Persons Protocol and the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and how they shape mobility in the continent. The second paper, looking at opening borders in the East African community, also written by Alan Hirsch. This report examines migration governance in East African community, currently the region with the fastest progress on free movement in Africa. The last paper, Migration Governance in West Africa, ECOWAS, the ECOWAS model, which has been written by Amadi. This report analyzes ECOWAS, the region long considered the continental leader in free trade movement. So we have our speakers that will be looking at these 3 papers in detail and taking us through all we need to know. And we will also, in terms of our program, we have welcoming and opening remarks, which is what I've just done. We also have introduction to NSI's migration and governance work, which will be done by Alan Hirsch. And then we have also Alan presenting on the papers that NSI has released in respect to this topic. And then we have a presentation on 2025 research papers by Victor Amadi. We have responses from discussants Otila Anna Munganidze and Brian Chigawa. And then we have responses from discussants. Then we will have a moderated discussion where we will get questions from the audience, and we will be able to invite you with your questions and feedback from the audience. I am going to invite Alan now to just take us through the introduction, and then later on he will do his presentation on NSI migration. Thank you. Over to you, Alan.
Thank you very much, Yoliswa, and thank you to everybody who's attending, and especially my fellow panelists. I'm going to do the 2 parts in one. So I'm first going to talk a bit more generally, and then just go briefly into the specifics. Yoliswa said in detail. Well, if you want the detail, go to the papers. We're not able to share too much detail with you today, unless you want to engage on questions of detail in the discussion afterwards. Which I understand. If you do have points you want to raise or questions, to please put them in the chat, and we'll organize them into a conversation. So yeah, and thank you especially to Victor, my colleague Victor Amadi, who's a postdoc fellow and lecturer at the University of Cape Town in the law school, at Otilia Mangutse at the ISS, and Brian Chigawa, who has been advising regional organizations in Africa on the free movement of people for a long time. So it's great to have such experienced people. joining us. Just a simple point to start with, and that is, in Africa, we are generally moving in the right direction with regard to immigration policy reform. It's very slow, and I think, if you read the annual report that the African Development Bank puts out on visa-free travel in Africa, you can see it's a snail-paced reform, but at least it's reform in the right direction. It's not like some of the rest of the world where barriers are going up. We're not putting barriers up, except sometimes in response to other people putting barriers up against us. So in general, we are heading in the right direction, but extremely slowly. Now, to what extent do regional organizations contribute to helping us move forward? And that's that's the topic of today's conversation. And I should mention, I'm also going to talk about SADC a bit. Victor's really the expert on SADC, but whereas Victor has taken the lead on the AU paper, I'm taking the lead on a SADC paper, which isn't out yet, but I will refer to. That's the Southern African Development Community. What do we mean by free movement in Africa? Well, people mean very different things. I think there are some people who are romantic Pan-Africanists, and I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean that in a way that it's perhaps more idealistic than practical, who believe that we can eliminate Africa's borders. On the other extreme, and I'm painting these extremes because to give you a sense of the polarities of the conversation, we have securocrats. And securocrats who are very often in control of immigration policy in South Africa and in Africa and in other parts of the world, are generally afraid. They're afraid of the hordes of migrants looking for work or to come to steal or murder or commit terrorist acts. There's a fear that overrides the approach to migration. Between the two, there is perhaps a way to find a more sensible position. Both of those positions are really misguided, and I'll say a few words about why. Well, firstly, they're misguided because, well, the romantics are misguided because we have nation states in Africa. Like it or not, the nation states that were bequeathed to us by decolonization process are nation states. They are accountable to their citizens in one way or another. And there's no ways that leaders cannot be accountable to those citizens. At this point, they're not ready. They're not ready to say, okay, we can open the borders, and for reasons perhaps we can get back to later. As for the securocrats, there are threats. Of course, there are threats, but they're nowhere near as unmanageable as are made out. Clearly, there are issues of terrorism in parts of Africa, and there are criminals who will take advantage of the systems if we don't have ways of finding them. But as far as work seekers are concerned, and that's often the biggest fear, it's really a small problem in Africa compared to some other parts of the world. The number of work, let's take a couple of examples. And the two countries which have the largest number of migrant workers, people who've entered the country as workers, are Cote d'Ivoire in West Africa and South Africa. Certainly as a proportion of their population, they're the largest. South Africa, our total foreign migrants, people who are born in other countries living in South Africa, is somewhere between 4% and 5%. That's not the official number. The official number is somewhere between 2% and 3%, but that's wrong. It's actually around 4% to 5%, for reasons we could go into if you want to. But in Cote d'Ivoire, the number is about 7% to 9%. Now that compares with some parts of the world where the percentages are in double figures. The average percentage of foreign-born people living in OECD countries, the rich countries of the world basically, is about 15%. So that's double Cote d'Ivoire. 3 times South Africa. So our problems are relatively small by global standards, and African migration is relatively small by global standards. So I think both the Securicates and the Romantics, miss the point, and partly they miss the point because perhaps they don't understand what the African Union actually meant when it developed a protocol on the free movement of persons. I'm going to read the AU definition on the free movement of persons from the protocol, which was agreed at a summit in 2018, but unfortunately hasn't been ratified. It reads, free movement of persons means the right of nationals of a member state to enter and move freely and reside in another member state in accordance with the laws of the host member state, and to exit the host member state in accordance with the laws and procedures for exiting that state. So free movement is perhaps a misnomer. What we are really talking about is regular movement, is movement of people who have proper documentation, who go through the requirements, whether it's a visa, whether it's just to have digital ID or whatever, and they go through the proper border posts. At the moment, that's not so easy in much of Africa. So that's what the objective is. And Victor will talk more about the AU protocol, but essentially there was an idea of 3 phases. First, visa-free travel for a limited period of time, then the right to work and perhaps reside temporarily, and then the right of establishment, which meant longer-term commitment and starting businesses and so on. We're not near that in most parts of Africa. So we've actually done we've completed about 8 studies so far. 2 of them were cross-cutting framework studies. 3 of them were country studies. We looked at Nigeria, South Africa, and Kenya, and 4 of them are regional organizations: the AU, AFCFTA, the SADC, which isn't out yet, ECOWAS, and the East African Community. And both in looking at the countries and in looking at the regions, we were looking at regions which are relatively more successful and countries which are relatively more successful than others, or more advanced than others in governance respects in particular. So we weren't looking at, it's not an average for the African case, but it's a sense of where we can possibly go and what the boundary looks like at the moment for moving forward. And we used a couple of methodological techniques in trying to analyze the data. So we present a lot of data and then we analyze it, and we used something that we call gap analysis, which really looks at the gap between rhetoric at the one end and outcomes at the other end. And there's several gaps within that we examine as an analytical methodology. And then we also look at political economy. And what we established, I guess, that stands in the way of regular movement or freer movement of Africans across African borders is a lack of trust, a lack of understanding, issues with documentation, issues in the management of borders, the lack of common standards between countries in terms of documentation, in terms of border management systems, and so on, and in general, issues with compatible systems. How compatible are the systems of managing people crossing borders between the different countries? But beyond that, if we look at the political economy part of it, there is the question of inequality and the question of dependence. So if we go back to those 2 examples I mentioned earlier, Cote d'Ivoire and South Africa, both are countries where poorer countries, which are neighboring countries, in the case of Cote d'Ivoire, it's the inland, the Sahel countries, Niger, Burkina Faso, and so on. In South Africa's case, it's countries like Lesotho, Mozambique, Malawi, and others have become dependent on South Africa for employment as a result of the history of the migrant labor system. So there was a migrant labor. First of all, in West Africa, there was a massive slavery system. When slavery ended, that actually transmuted into a migrant labor system where people were working in the coastal countries, coming from the inland countries. In South Africa, we didn't have regional slavery. We did have slavery in South Africa, but there were people from further away usually. But we have had a massive system of migrant labor where very large numbers of people from neighboring countries became dependent on South Africa for their living. So that inequality and dependence can be a very big part of the obstacles, really, to finding an adequate solution for moving forward. So to move on to the second part, the more specific part, as Yolisa said, I'll deal with SADC and the EAC, and Victor will deal with ECOWAS, the AU, and AFCFTA. In short, both SADC and the EAC are moving in the right direction, but the EAC is much further down the road. Perhaps the biggest and most important difference is that the EAC has a common market protocol. So in 2010, the countries that were then members of the East African Community agreed on a common market protocol, which basically said free movement of labor, of capital, and of factors of production, investment, and people. That's been implemented to a significant extent, but unevenly within East Africa. But it is a very serious legal commitment of all the countries of East Africa, and it's being implemented progressively. There is an asymmetric developments in East Africa. So some countries have moved further ahead than others. So I think, those of you who are familiar with East Africa will know that there's a grouping of 3 countries which about 12, 13 years ago agreed to work more closely together: Rwanda, Uganda, and Kenya. And then there are other members of the East African community who are more or less committed to the level of integration on the movement of people as those 3 countries. So it's uneven. It's much easier if you're a Kenyan to work in Rwanda than if you're a Burundian to work in some of the other countries, for example. Another factor that I think is interesting about East Africa is the one-stop border post system. So the one-stop border post system came in even before the common market. The first one-stop border post was commissioned in 2002, and there are now 15 one-stop border posts within East Africa, operating not exactly, they don't operate at exactly the same level, and they don't have exactly the same systems. Some of them are really one-stop, some of them are 2 stops, but highly integrated. But they are working really well. I mean, in general, they're working really well. In general, they've really facilitated the movement of people, and not only formal travelers, but also people who live in those border areas who have relatives or business or friends across the border. They've tended to facilitate that process very, very effectively as well. So the one-stop border posts have been really, really impressive in East Africa, I think more so than anywhere else. And to the extent that East Africans tend to cross borders in a very large proportion in the formal manner rather than informally, which is the case in some other parts of Africa where there's much more informal border crossing. I think what the concern in East Africa is that beyond the three members advancing quite far and some improvements in terms of work permits, the newer members of the East African community aren't fully integrated into the movement of people regime, especially South Sudan and Somalia and the DRC. And it could be argued, and it would be interesting if people have other points of view, but it could be argued that the process towards free movement in East Africa has plateaued. It's reached a certain level and it's not progressing as quickly anymore. As far as SADC is concerned, there's no common market agreement. There is a free trade agreement, but that doesn't include the movement of people. There were two attempts at a protocol, a movement of people protocol. The first one was very idealistic and expected, very rapid opening of borders. And that wasn't supported by the richer countries in the area, Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, one or two others. So it eventually wasn't, it didn't come into force. And then there was an attempt at a more modest facilitation protocol, facilitation of movement, which basically tried to give a kind of a momentum to the bilateral and plurilateral efforts at migration reform in the region. But even that one, which I think is a feasible and practical one, didn't get ratified by sufficient countries to come into force. Still, there is progress. There's progress through bilateral agreements. South Africa has recently put out a white paper on a national labor migration policy, which is very progressive in certain respects on migration reform. It does refer to the possibility of a quota for migrants in sector by sector in South Africa, and that probably is going to be codified in law, but I don't think it will have a massive material effect. I think what's more important is the commitment to modernize the bilateral labor migration agreements, which go back to the colonial era. They are still quite colonial in form. And there is what seems to be a serious commitment from the Department of Employment and Labor in South Africa to move forward on that. And then there are other examples. So Namibia and Botswana have got an agreement to allow people to cross borders without passports, as long as they have digital identification documents. And that allows for the people along that long border between Botswana and Namibia to be more functional in their relation to, they want to buy something or they want to see somebody, whatever. It's a lot easier. They don't have to, there are a lot of people who don't expect ever to travel very long distances, but they would like to see their friends or colleagues across the border, and that's made that a lot easier. And there are other agreements emerging. There's a recent agreement that's been signed between Zambia and Zimbabwe, which looks very interesting. I don't know, we're not very sure what the implications are going to be, but there are a number of those initiatives in the region. I think another thing to mention is that compared with East Africa, Southern Africa seems to be more advanced in the alignment of their social security systems and the qualifications frameworks. And those are both incredibly important for regional integration. Social security, if you can move to a job in another country and keep the same pension or have the pension transferred seamlessly, that makes a huge difference to your mobility. And that's where Southern Africa is moving quite significantly. And then qualifications, if you want to move to another country, are your qualifications recognized in the same way as they are in your country? And I think here SADC has made significant advances. But in general, I think the regional migration reform processes for these two cases anyway have stalled. Or they are very slow now. In relation to SADC, what's striking is that the agenda of SADC meetings refers very rarely and at a pretty superficial level to movement of people questions. It doesn't seem to be anywhere near the priority of the SADC Secretariat or the political bodies of SADC, which is quite striking and quite different from the East African community, where the Secretariat is much more committed to driving the process forward, and the East African Court of Justice has played a significant role in trying to push the process forward as well. But still, so I guess the question is, where is the impetus going to come from to move forward next? Is it going to come from bilateral arrangements or asymmetric arrangements? Maybe within SADC, a few countries will get together, like the group of countries in East Africa. Or is SADC actually going to take the issue more seriously? Or perhaps at the continental level, there might be progress. And those are some of the issues, I'd really like to discuss in this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Before you hand over, if you allow me, colleagues, just to highlight briefly that Alan Hirsch is a research fellow and the head of the Migration Governance Reform in Africa program at the New South Institute. He is an accomplished economist and a public policy expert with a rich background in both academia and government. He's born in Cape Town. He was educated at UCT, Wits, and Columbia. His career spans both teaching and policymaking, having taught at UCT before joining the South African Department of Trade and Industry in 1995. From 2002 to 2012, he managed economic policy within the South African presidency, where he was instrumental in shaping the country's economic trajectory. Hirsch's extensive experience and leadership in economic policy are a tremendous asset to the New South Institute, where his deep knowledge of economic reform and inclusive growth bolsters the Institute's mission to foster transparent and accountable governance. He serves on the board of the European Centre for Development Policy Management and is a member of President Ramaphosa's Economic Advisory Council. Hirsch has held distinguished roles globally, including as a visiting scholar at Harvard Business School, a regular visiting professor at Maastricht University, and a fellow at the Oxford Martin School. His recent publications, such as The Season of Hope, Economic Reform under Mandela and Mbeki, and the Oxford Companion to South African Economics, contribute to the global discourse on economic development and governance, aligning with the NSI's goals of driving sustainable and inclusive policy reforms. Again, apologies that I couldn't read it earlier on. I just had some challenges on my part.
Thank you. Yes. I just want to say I didn't write that one.
That's fine, Alan. Don't worry. The next one, the next presentation on the 2025 research, we are going to get it from Victor Amadi, and I do want to introduce Victor before we start. Victor has a publication called Free Movement in West Africa, the African Union, AfCFTA, and the Continental Integration, together with Alan. Victor Amadi is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for Comparative Law in Africa at the University of Cape Town. He holds a Bachelor of Law, LLB, and an LLM, and a doctorate in Mercantile and Labor Law from University of Western Cape. His research focuses on trade, regional integration, and development in Africa, with a particular emphasis on free movement of people within the Southern African Development Community. His doctoral thesis explored how facilitating intra-regional trade through free movement contributes to regional integration, aligning with the New South Institute's mission to improve governance and strengthen state institutions. Victor's expertise in comparative law and his research into regional trade and integration play a crucial role in NSI's efforts to address governance challenges in Africa. His academic contributions and his work as the managing editor of the Journal of Comparative Law in Africa strengthens NSI's capacity to engage with complex governance issues. As a passionate advocate for practical evidence-based solutions, Victor brings valuable insights that contribute to NSI's work in shaping more effective, transparent, and accountable public institutions across Africa. His publication, Trade, Migration, and Law, Free Movement of People in Southern Africa, further supports NSI's goal of providing actionable research that drives positive change in the region. On that note, over to you, Dr. Victor Amadi. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Yoliswa, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Alan, for setting the scene and just perhaps making my own presentation much easier. So I will be speaking broadly on two frameworks, looking at the African Union and the Economic Community of West African States. So as you see there from the title, I have that word free in quotes, ideally to kind of echo Alan's earlier definition as to how this word is being interpreted from the romantics and those who come from a very securitized perspective. So free movement, at least from my own perspective, is not a word that is kind of applied literally. So it's a very qualified word, so very suggestive of how do we make movement more freer or somewhat facilitated. So I think that broadly is the question and the perspective through which I engage with the subject, and adopting that to the African Union and ECOWAS. That's the lens through which I kind of approach both papers. And looking at the African Union at a go, the African Union basically is the continental integration architecture. So broadly looking at all 55 countries being part of this institution, so how does it enable or try to make sure that the free movement of person is actually achieved? So it's been a long-standing vision of the African Union, going way back from its earlier formation, the Organization for African Unity, which led to the earlier formulation of the continental blueprint in the form of the Lagos Plan of Action, that basically set out the foundation for the establishment of an African Economic Community, which formulation in the under the Abuja Treaty echoes like forming an African Economic Community. And looking at the Abuja Treaty in forming the African Economic Community, based off its objectives and how it looks to actualize that objective, one of the stages it actually proposes is establishing a common market that is underpinned by principles of free movement of persons, right of residence, and rights of establishment. So this goes as way back as 1991. And part of what that instrument actually suggested is this arrangement, as you see unfolding on the continent right now, that countries can individually, can bilaterally, can regionally engage in this subject of trying to gradually remove obstacles towards the movement of persons. So there was a flexible underpinning to actually how this would unfold on the continent as way back as 91. And also countries were to negotiate an agreement to regulate this subject in more detail. So between 91 and 2018, that's where we actually now see this key document actually emerging. So that's a span of just over or about 27 years, if I'm not mistaken. So between when that obligation was actually enshrined under the Abuja Treaty and 2018, when this agreement came into play. And from 2018, when this agreement came into play, we see that, as Alan had mentioned, this agreement or this protocol to the treaty basically entrenching this right of residence, entry, and establishment remains unratified. So what we have on the continent basically is you have a normative arrangement in principle, but in terms of the operationalization of that instrument, it's lacking at this point in time, because what really needs this protocol to kick into effect is 15 countries have to ratify that agreement. So far you have 4 countries that have engaged and ratified the agreement, so that being Mali, Niger, Sao Tome and Principe, and Rwanda. So out of 55 countries, at least you need 15 countries to get this agreement going. So what the agreement actually suggests, as Alan mentioned, is a phased approach, looking at firstly ensuring the right of entry for a specified period of time, and also going further to ensure the right of residence and establishment as much broader stages, and also have initiatives towards having a standardized document to operationalize this mobility right in the form of an African passport, and a host of other provisions that actually suggests ensuring perhaps free movement around border communities, movement of researchers, students, and the likes. So it's a very, very broad instrument, but very, very important is the fact that, as Alan had mentioned, there are clear safeguards that are actually embodied in the text, in that in adopting these rights, you have to also take cognizance of the national laws of the host state. And also, quite importantly, inherent restrictions. Look at, for instance, right of entry, where, in adopting those rights, that it could be limited in instances of public safety, public health, public security, and the likes. So it's not really a blanket or an absolute right in that sense. And going further, looking at the African Union, and as Alan had mentioned, so how do we then think about mobility going forward in the African context, considering this agreement or this protocol is not in play? So do we suggest focusing on the regional arrangements? Should we look at bilateral approaches, or should countries unilaterally engage with this arrangement? Because in a way, we see between last year, I think, countries basically do what the protocol suggests in perhaps adopting visa waivers or engaging in bilateral waivers. Country A, country B basically just open up and allow their citizens to basically move between those countries, and a different country could adopt an approach where they unilaterally just decide to open up to all Africans, as the case may be. So these divergent approaches, which would be the best, and also considering now we have the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement in place. And what this agreement actually suggests, looking at its specific objectives, is that as part of creating this African economic community, we have to ensure that this market that we seek to create in terms of the free trade area, this single African market, in engaging in the trading in goods and services, what really has to propel that process should be the facilitation of the movement of persons. So there is also some kind of qualification within the AFCFTA framework. I don't know, as much as we want to create this single market, an enabling measure would be to ensure that the movement of persons is facilitated in that sense. So looking at the AFCFTA in itself, so it does not specifically regulate human mobility. So it's a trade agreement. So it's specific to just informing or having this rules-based system where partner states basically decide how they're going to liberalize trade, trade and services, and other aspects within the AFCFTA architecture in terms of competition, investment, and the likes. But what is very particular to mobility is the protocol on trade and services, which in itself informs this idea of a mode for service supply in the form of the presence of natural persons in a host state. So basically, members or partner states decide to agree or adopt market access obligations and decide to open their markets to the different modes of service supply, and basically have individuals or professionals, as the case may be in terms of the service protocol, to more or less supply their service in another state. So that's just putting it simply. But as the case may be with this, countries have to make, or they have to outline their specific obligations, be it towards market access, national treatment, or the MFN outline those obligations under their schedules of commitment. So they commit to liberalizing all service sectors across all modes of service supply, or they basically decide to adopt a sector-specific approach towards that kind of liberalization. So what I propose, or what the conversation largely is looking at trade liberalization on one end and mobility as two sides of the same coin. And as Alan had mentioned, the appetite towards a continental approach, which is more blanket and focused on all Africans, might not be politically appealing to all member states. But considering the economic initiative that AFCFTA seeks to drive, looking at a focused approach of how do we ensure labor mobility across specific service sectors, and basically gradually phase that into other economic actors like informal cross-border traders and the general African population. So broadly that perspective. So going from the African Union, which in itself, yes, it has made some strides when it comes to regulating the movement of persons. Within the regional context, you look at the one regional bloc that has had a very long-standing arrangement of the movement of persons, which I think has much more lessons to offer, across other sub-regional blocks as well as the African Union, and that will be the Economic Community of West African States, which since its inception in the early mid-1970s has had a protocol on the movement of persons. So as early as 1979, it adopted its first protocol on the movement of persons, which again suggests a three-phased approach, looking at the right of entry for ECOWAS citizens, the right of residence, and the right of establishment. And very peculiar to ECOWAS is the fact that this initiative is, one that emanates from its founding treaty in 1975 and was re-emphasized in its revised treaty in 93 towards, also establishing a common market. And quite instructive, I think, within ECOWAS is also looking at how it more or less tried to regulate the movement of persons. So unlike the AU, which has a very structured and one protocol informing all three phases, within ECOWAS, you have three distinct protocols that are very instructive to specific phases. So for instance, you have the protocol of 1979, which more or less is the bedrock instrument, kind of blanket regulation of the movement of persons. And then you have specific instruments on residence in 1986, and you have an instrument on the right of establishment, which was adopted in 1990. And all three instruments, different levels also of engagement and implementation. So largely you have the 1979 protocol, which has largely been adopted across now 13 or 12 member states rather of ECOWAS, with the exit of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, but initially this applied to all three countries. And residence and establishment are still not really much implemented, and progress has stalled across both phases. But what stands out within ECOWAS is right from its inception, you have this push towards having standardized operational tools to support mobility. So initially you had the ECOWAS passport that was adopted or brought about in the early 2000s, and subsequently you had the National Biometric ID, which was adopted in, I think, 2014. And quite interestingly, these instruments were not really defined within the text as travel documents per se, but through a supplementary act that basically amended the definitions under the 1979 protocol, adopted these two instruments as key travel documents to ensure the movement of persons and mobility within the region. And quite instructive and very important also, I think, are the roles of the Commission, which again, largely, I think, has been quite instrumental in sensitizing and also ensuring that this initiative is actually not stifled. And during the research, quite recently noticed, post 2008, where ECOWAS had adopted the common approach, you had initiatives like the migration policy, which is a very recent development, as well as, this year, the labor migration strategy and action plan, which is equally recent. And they also have a push now to, think of how do you bring this whole development-oriented thinking by expanding mobility provisions to non-ECOWAS member states. I think this is the level now the ECOWAS is actually trying to push in terms of creating a Schengen-type arrangement within ECOWAS. So there is some kind of momentum going on within the sub-region. And also quite instructive to me, I think, is the role of the court, the ECOWAS Court of Justice. So I was very particular to engage with some of the decisions within the ECOWAS Court of Justice for two reasons. That one, the matters that actually brought before the court are matters by individuals, and also matters that actually demonstrate some of the challenges that are actually very, very pertinent within the sub-region. So for instance, you have cases of arbitrary border closures. Member states just opts to close the border for reasons, for instance, in the case of Femi Falana versus, you have the case of Femi Falana, who is a Nigerian, was a son. And basically in his trip between Togo and the defendant states, he faced this arbitrary border closures because of an election that was going on in the destination country, and basically brought a suit before the ECOWAS Court of Justice, claiming an infringement of the Article 12 right to freedom of movement based on the African Charter, and also highlighting provisions of infringement on the protocol on the movement of persons. So what that court or that case highlighted again, for me, was the fact that what the court did was emphasize the scope and the limits of the movement of persons. So in as much as member states are obligated to ensure that the movement of persons and the rights around that particular movement are, ensured and are also promoted, countries can raise specific conditions or reasons for restricting those rights, such as public security, public health, and the likes. And what that decision actually emphasized was the fact that, in as much as you can raise those limitations, you cannot do so arbitrarily. So what you have to do is you have to ground those restrictions based on law and due process. And findings I also saw perhaps also within the case of Balde, Senegal, and even broadly within the AU context, looking at the African Court on Human and People's Rights, you see similar decisions in Anudo Cheng versus Tanzania, where there's that emphasis on not arbitrarily closing borders for reasons that are not based on law, and also not following due
Sorry,
process.
Dr. Amadi.
Yeah.
If I can disturb you just to ask if you can move towards conclusion. Thank you.
Okay, so so the cases to me also just very much underline the very relevance of the court. And I just listed a few other cases also to highlight some of the limitations. So just to conclude, looking at both institutions and broadly trying to get some lessons. So what really comes to me in reflecting on both frameworks from a comparative standpoint, looking at the AU, how far it has informed the movement of persons, progress really has been slow. Looking at ECOWAS in itself, ECOWAS has made significant progress, but that in itself indicates that, as far back as in the 1970s, where the initial protocol was adopted, much progress has only been made from the first phase. So the second and the third phase are very much lagging, which suggests perhaps, this phased approach, while very instructive and good, would require some level of institutional support and political will to actually get this process going. So the AFCFTA, to me, could be one of those instruments that actually propels this initiative of migration or human mobility, ideally from an economic standpoint, moving or ensuring that individuals that are economic actors could be the initial phase or initial actors to engage in mobility, and that could then gradually progress into subsequent actors that are more encompassed under the African Union Protocol on the movement of persons. I had a few other recommendations in the role of institutions, making an argument for a central institution that could coordinate and monitor and enforce the initiative on migration, issues around border management, which is again key for those who are really concerned about the security aspects of movement, and also looking at how we could scale, looking at inter-regional arrangements or inter-regional recognition. So one, ECOWAS is making progress. So how much is recognized between ECOWAS and the EAC, for instance, because mobility across regions are somewhat limited. So how do we go beyond just moving within the sub-region and also trying to find measures to ensure that, you know, an ECOWAS citizen, perhaps based on the progress made within ECOWAS, could equally gain recognition and move within the EAC, for instance, or SADC, and that could scale to a more continental level. So yes, that will be it from my side. Thank you, Yoliswa.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amadi. I'm going to move on with the program. I see that we're also losing some people. We have a finishing time, which is 4 o'clock, and we don't want to impose further time to our guests in the program. I'm going to now call upon our next speaker. We're going to have responses from discussants, Otilia Anna Munganize and Brian Chigawa. A little bit about Otilia is that she was very modest in sharing about herself for the introduction today. So she indicated that she is the head of special projects in the Office of the Executive Director at the Institute for Security Studies. Otilia, if I may please invite you and do alert you on time that you have 10 minutes to talk through to us regarding what you have prepared as a response to the 2 presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yoliswa. I'll try to speak for less than 10 minutes because I'm mindful of everyone's time. So I'll speak to 3 things. The first is around situating the current conversation on free movement within the migration policy framework for Africa. So taking it away from sort of the instruments that require ratification and addressing one of the points that Alan raised around whether the future on free movement for the continent centers on bilateral or trilateral arrangements at a sub-regional level over a continental framework while we wait for that process. The second is just a reflection on some of the reasons people move, and in particular, the majority, let's say, of visa applicants at the moment within the African continent. And then I'll end with just why or the direction to which migration governance can be geared. So first, on the migration policy framework for Africa. There are 7 priorities, but I'm going to highlight just a few of those that connect with these issues around freedom of movement. So the first is around migration and development, so connecting mobility and people on the move to development. This, of course, has its root, as Victor alluded to already, within the framework of the African Economic Community, so going all the way back to the Abuja Treaty, which is now 45 years old. The second is around the need to advance regular and labor migration. So looking towards ensuring that the majority of people or all people that are moving on the continent do so following legal pathways. The third relates to integration of migrants and communities that are receiving them, but also just generally across the board, socioeconomic and developmental integration. Then the fourth aspect relates to border management and security, which was the last point that Victor alluded to. Now, these are 4 out of the 7 priorities under the migration policy framework for Africa. And I would argue that while we do have sub-regional and regional instruments that speak to free movement and mobility, these 4 are instrumental in the way in which individual countries start to negotiate bilateral arrangements. And the reason they're doing so for the most part is, of course, we go back to state sovereignty. While countries are members of regional mechanisms and regional economic communities, they really do function independently, even of those regional mechanisms. For the Southern African Development Community, through the Migration Dialogue for Southern Africa, what came out quite prominently is that member states are, some of them, interested in free movement, but they put their sovereignty first, and they argue that the best building blocks for freer movement in the region are to first ensure a harmonization of legal frameworks. So having laws around immigration, both regular and irregular migration that are harmonized in the region. They also argued, as was the case argued by Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Botswana, that countries must first initiate a process of data sharing. So some of the data that we have, for example, in SADC varies from, let's say in South Africa, between 600,000 to 8 million migrants in the country. Now that discrepancy makes it extremely difficult for planning, but it also makes it difficult for coordination and pushes towards free movement. And then when it comes to the facilitation of regular as well as labor migration, the history, as Alan alluded to, is quite important in understanding countries' perspectives on this. For countries where labor migration built their economies, South Africa is an example, where through mining and other labor migration from the sub-region, we have a lot of migrant communities now in their second and third generation in South Africa, but the process around regularization has been varied. Then when we talk about issues around border management and security, concerns that were raised by countries here in Southern Africa, such as Botswana, Lesotho, Eswatini, Namibia, and South Africa, it was around arguing that, yes, we can have freer movement, but this doesn't take away the obligation to effectively manage the territory of individual countries. It is for this reason, as I move to point 2, that you see more bilateral arrangements. Now, when you look at the bilateral and multilateral arrangements, you'll see that since the adoption of the Free Movement Protocol across the regions, Southern Africa, East Africa, and West Africa, you see that more bilateral arrangements have evolved. This means that while in 2018, here in Southern Africa, the majority of Southern African citizens required a visa for Angola, that is no longer the case for many Southern Africans to travel to Angola. But this is as a result of bilateral 30, 60, and 90-day arrangements. In the East African community, you see different arrangements centered around tourism and as well as the movement around services. For example, between Rwanda, Kenya, and Uganda, facilitating a uni visa that allows people who are visiting the region for tourism purposes to be able to move freely within those countries. We also see Rwanda easing its visa processes and allowing visa-free access for AU member states. So as part of the border process, both in the East African community, but also continentally. So these are moves that I think also need to be analyzed at country level, because the majority of countries still maintain that migration is a national competence before it becomes a regional. I'll then turn to my last point in terms of the direction that migration governance is geared towards. And this is a point that already came out in Alan's input in particular, which is that it is going to center around bilateral arrangements, almost as the building blocks towards freer movement. Until you have those arrangements at intra-regional level, it will be near impossible to have the African economic community fully integrated. But the issues that are raised around security can't just be easily dismissed because there's a desire for freer movement. It means that until we have more stable societies and spaces, both at sub-regional but also supracontinental level, that there will always be resistance towards full continental free movement. The final point that I would say is this does not mean that people will not continue to move. In fact, through the International Organization for Migration's most recent Africa report, it shows that the majority of people will continue to move and within the African continent. The higher the restrictions doesn't mean a reduced number of people. It just means that more people may choose irregular pathways to do so. So the task is to ensure that most people move following regular channels rather than irregular. Finally, just to congratulate the research team on mapping the different instruments. But as we know, the proof of any pudding is in the tasting. And when it comes to legal instruments, it will always be in how they are implemented by individual countries as well as by the regional economic communities. Thank you very much, Yoliswa.
Thank you, Ottilia, very much for that brief and concise input. And I think my last speaker for the day, and then we open up for questions, it's going to be Brian Chigawa. Brian has not sent us a detailed profile regarding where he is and what he is doing currently. But I am aware that he is a consultant in migration-related aspects. And I would just invite you, Brian, as you take your 10 minutes to share with us as a discussant, and maybe you can introduce yourself briefly so that the participants could also understand who you are and where you come from. Thank you.
Hi, thanks, Yolisa. You can see my picture there. I think where I am, it would be better if I don't switch on my video so that I can be, audible. I think I don't have a lot to say about myself. I think I sent a summary bio to Delani, just earlier on in the day, but suffice to say that I'm a lawyer by profession, and I have been working in regional integration for about 25 years now. And apart from being legal counsel, formerly in COMESA, I was also heading the migration unit in COMESA. So I've participated in a number of migration programs on the continent, at the sub-regional level and at the continental level, as well as the international level. But maybe in the interest of time, because I don't have much time, is just to thank first Alan and also Victor for setting the scene on the issue that we have today before us. I think the question that has been asked about the role of African regional institutions in regularizing the mobility of people in Africa, I would say yes. The answer is yes, but the extent, matters quite a lot. And I think examples have been given of the regs that have been quite successful, such as East African Community and ECOWAS. And also there's been discussion about the African Union free movement of persons. But I think something that is unique that we need to talk about is what Alan started with. Alan started talking about the African nation state, that it is a construct. It's not a natural phenomenon, but a construct of the colonizers. That's what Alan said. And I do agree with that. And in addition to that, we have the principle of sovereignty, which we failed to remove from the Constitutive Act of the African Union. Because if we didn't have that one, maybe things would have been different. But this is where we are stuck, in the sense that, we have the African nation state, which was a foreign construct, one. And secondly, we also have the principle of sovereignty that member states use to, to push for their, independence in terms of doing things. But when you look at the regs that have been successful in the area of free movement of persons, and the two examples that have been given, EAC and ECOWAS, I will try and focus a little bit on EAC. I think one of the advantages that EAC has had was to put free movement of persons within the Common Market Protocol. So that embedding of free movement of persons program within the Common Market Program at least sorted out quite a number of problems that a number of member states have. And like when you look at the African Union Free Movement Protocol, it's a standalone protocol. And on the other side, you have the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. And when you look also at another aspect, in addition to the fact that the African nation is not a natural phenomenon, but a construct, you also look at the models of movement of programs on free movement of persons that we have in Africa were largely modeled on foreign models, especially the EU. Most of the regs, looked up to the EU, and we'll try to replicate that on the African continent. And that has also got its challenges, in the sense that to that effect, because we have not put the issue of free movement of person in our context, on the African context, we lack a deeper understanding and appreciation of the nexus between effective migration governance and development. Maybe if we had started by, analyzing this and, making sure that all stakeholders on the continent understand the nexus between effective migration governance and development, we could have been somewhere. But there are also a number of issues that have been outlined by both Alan and Victor in terms of the challenges that we face. For example, the issue of different levels of development on the continent. And this issue of different levels of development, the moment you start talking about free movement of persons, people think of the flooding of foreign workers in your country, and it becomes an issue. And it goes on to breed xenophobic. And xenophobia everywhere on the African continent, not restricted to one continent. And within the last few decades, especially the last 4 decades, you've seen African regional institutions putting a number of measures that in order to facilitate movement of persons. I think some of these initiatives have been discussed. Alan talked of the one-stop border posts, and Victor also talked about issues of coordinated border management and integrated border management. We've also had programs such as small-scale cross-border trade initiative that has been implemented by COMESA in terms of looking at the mobility of small-scale cross-border traders across the region. So indeed, there have been a number of initiatives that have been given, including the development of regional labor migration databases, which can help with the development of laws and policies so that they are evidence-based. And now, understanding my background, which is mainly on trade, international trade, you realize that the more we are moving now for focusing trade in goods to trade in services, now we have to change the debate, because the past 30 years, most of regional integration agendas in terms of trade have been focusing on trade in goods. But now there's been a realizing that, there's more we can gain by promoting trade in services, which is already going on. We just need to formalize them. This is why we have also specific protocols on trade in services. And with regards to issues of trade in services, you have challenges, in terms of implementing. And I think Alan talked about some successes in the Southern African part. For example, in the context of SADC, where they adopted a mutual recognition of qualifications and skills framework. which in other regional organizations is not there. ESC has also got one. So we've seen traction in terms of, professionals. The negotiation has been based on professionals. So, but we have to look at the developments in Africa to say, I think one of the things that has not been talked is that before we go to the African Continental Free Trade Area, 3 organizations, regional organizations on the continent decided to come together and start a path of convergence. That is EAC, COMESA, and SADC, which is at the level of a tripartite free trade arrangement. And that instrument has got an annex on movement of business persons. This shows the recognition and the efforts that regional economic communities are putting. If you go back to look at the MOU that underpins the establishment of the COMESA, ESC, SADC tripartite movement, you see that it's a full journey to convergence. There is no roadmap yet. There's no timelines are fixed on that, but this is another positive, issue that can be looked into. So one of the challenges, I think, taking from what Alan said about romantics and securocrats, is the issue of trying to come up with a balance. And that's what most of regional economic communities are doing, to come up with a balance of making sure that, the interest of the idealistics are taken into consideration, but also the interest of the challenges that are being raised by securocrats are also being addressed. So there are a number of initiatives on that one. But one of the things that we should be thankful of when you look at the protocol on free movement of personnel, the African Union, which is similar to some of the protocols of the other regional organizations, such as COMESA, is that it gives us opportunities in terms of how this can be done. You can do this at the individual level. You can also do this at the bilateral level, and you can also do this at the regional level. I think at the regional level, we've seen the example of what has been done between Kenya, Rwanda, and Uganda. And similarly, in the Southern African region, also, we have got ongoing discussions between Malawi, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. And we have also seen positive developments, which were outlined earlier on in terms of the relaxation of movement of persons between the Republic of Botswana and Republic of Namibia, where people can use, identity cards to cross. So I think looking at the time, I'll just cut short and say that, yes, the regional economic communities are doing well, and we've got good examples. For me, I have always known that, ECOWAS was the first to make progress. And I think we need to learn lessons from what ECOWAS, has done. And also EAC has made progress, but we seem to be in a situation where we are stuck now. We are not moving positively. Maybe we need to come up with maybe a number of initiatives that shapes advocacy in terms of our own African narration, because we're in a generation where regional integration is facing a number of challenges with the rising of protectionism in this world, which basically started from the Western, and, the snowball effects are getting to us. I thank you, Yolisa. I'm looking at the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. I think that I'm going to open it up if there's questions from participants in the webinar. I am going to open it up maybe to 3 questions, and then I'll get our speakers to engage with those questions. I don't see any hands from my side, but if from your side, Jelani and the team, you seeing any hands, you will alert me.
Yolisa, I think we were asking for written questions in the chat,
Oh,
but I don't see them. I don't see any there.
Okay, I have not checked the chat. Okay, I think what here is people who are introducing themselves, what I'm seeing. So I haven't seen any questions, and it doesn't look like we have any questions from the participant this far. But I just wanted to highlight a few things that I've just picked up as part of some research I was doing in respect to this, and perhaps the speakers could just comment as also part of their closing on some of those issues. Some of the issues that I picked up in terms of policy issues in migration within Africa is the whole issue of weak implementation of free movement policies. I think in the presentations it has come up one way or another. The other issue is poor coordination across governments within Africa, and even at a regional level first, even before you go through continentally. There is also lack of reliable migration data to some extent. So for those people who have to do studies and do policies on an ongoing basis, so from an evidence-based perspective, they might experience challenges because there seems to be lack of reliable migration data. There's also irregular migration and weak border governance, and I don't know how weak border governance contributes in particular to this irregular migration. Gaps in migrant and refugee protection. I think it's a big issue for countries like South Africa, the issue of refugee protection as well. Urban pressures, refugee protection from a point of having access to services, services such as your healthcare and education for refugees and even migrants to some extent. The other issue I picked up is generally the urban pressures and service delivery constraints. If you follow the debate on migration in South Africa, there's a big issue and a big concern. The competition is around access to resources. So you have people like organizations like Dudula that says that since we chased out migrants accessing our healthcare system in Hillbrow Clinic, for instance, in Hillbrow in Johannesburg, we think that the queues are manageable and we think that people are getting service. So how do we deal from a policy level with those particular issues? And the last issue for me from a policy level, again, was just the brain drain and the loss of skilled workers. So how do countries where there's all this immigration that's taking place, even within the continent, how do we deal with the issue of the loss of certain skills that may be required in the economies in those countries? So those would be just some of my broader comments, not necessarily questions, but I'd be happy if you could take your last 2 minutes, each one of you, to basically, or 3 minutes to basically maybe attend to those issues and address any other issue you may have wanted to address as we move towards closure. Maybe we should start with you, Alan.
Okay. On the Dudula story, I mean, if you are getting 2 billion rands worth of fraud and corruption minimum in the Gauteng health system, it's not surprising that people get bad service. Maybe it has improved or it hasn't improved in Hillbrow, but the reason for poor service to South Africans is basically the corruption and mismanagement of the health department, in this case, the Gauteng health department. I think that's, there's plenty of evidence of that. I just wanted to say that I think that quite a lot of progress can be made in areas that are not immediately threatening. Progress in civil registration systems, progress in coordinating documentation systems, progress in coordinating around border management systems between countries in a region or even a broader. And there are a number of technical reforms which can take place, which have to take place as governance improves in the nations which, of our continent. that allow for us to get to a point where the level of trust and understanding can improve considerably. So I think we should be putting a lot of attention on the question of dealing with those inequalities in development, especially in the development of systems and bureaucracies and integrities of systems, and building those so that we can all trust each other and we can make further progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. And where's my next speaker now? Oh, okay. Dr. Amadi, if you have a few things to say, please, I hand over to you.
Yeah, yeah, sorry. Okay, I think just to share a bit, so my thinking around migration, largely from an institutional standpoint, I largely have this very constant debate in my head around, the role of institutions for one, either from a supranational or intergovernmental standpoint, how that could trickle down to the nation state. So Alan and Brian, speak of the issue around sovereignty. Largely within this institutional setup, you have states basically be the primary decision makers of policies that are more influential to, issues of migration, for instance. And the key institutions that are responsible for driving the initiatives in terms of operationalizing what, is decided at those policy levels are somewhat stifled in that they don't necessarily have that status to influence when states do not comply. So how do you get them to a level where, they more or less have some kind of influence to non-compliant states? That is an aspect, again, I think it's worth considering in terms of institutional reforms to give some of this, institutions some kind of supranational status to be influential in decision making, and how, they kind of get states to comply. And also looking at this whole management and the implementation around migration, in as much as there's this top to bottom approach, I think there's also, from the ECOWAS experience at least, looking at, how the Commission operates in terms of sensitizing border officials to some of the irregularities and how they more or less engage in activities at the border. I think that's also a very good kind of thing to consider in terms of, those bottom-up initiative in sensitizing officials, engaging with, key actors when it comes to border management to more or less be aware of, these instruments, what they seek to do, and how it could be operationalized. And yeah, I think that would be just a few remarks from my side in terms of, engaging with this initiatives going forward.
Thank you. Ottilia and Brian, I don't want to lock you outside in case you have something brief to say.
Look, Yolisa, a lot of the points have already been said and re-emphasized. I think for me, it's to just reiterate that people on the African continent will move in spite of policies, in spite of strategies. And so the task for states, the task for those developing policies and strategies is to develop strategies that actually meet the people where they are. Because what we are seeing is where you do not have the level of policies responding to the different flows, whether sub-regionally or otherwise, that this actually
looks like we lost her. Okay, maybe Brian, if you want to say something.
Yes, Yolisa, you mentioned the issue of brain drain. in, as one of the effects of migration. I had a boss who used to tell me that, you should not worry about that. Just train more. We're a region saddled with, high unemployment rates. So I think we need to find solution to this. But one of the solutions can be effective negotiation of bilateral labor agreements. What we can do is to make sure that the bilateral labor agreements we are negotiating with countries that are getting labor from our region is to make sure that they have components of training, funded. We are giving them, our human resource, and they should be able to contribute also to, the training. So I think this is another area that we need to look at in terms of, skills development and engaging by enhancing our negotiation skills in terms labor, bilateral, multilateral labor migration and agreements. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. And if I may just say that I see in the program that my name is put to do the closing remarks. And I just want to quickly just to say thank you first to everyone for participating in this webinar and for attending and being part of this. Our speakers and the discussants as well, for really putting so much effort in bringing the content to us and also making it user-friendly for those people who may not necessarily be also in that similar space. And the NSI team for putting this together, I'm sure that team is very exhausted, but hopefully this is your last critical project, because now we're in December and your effort is always appreciated for putting this together. We do quite a number of webinars as in NSI as part of the work that we do in advocating for reforms in the public sector, in migration, and the various other elements of our work that we do. And lastly, I do want to say, I suppose in all this, a key takeaway once more for me is that we do need committed, in fact, we do need administrative and political will to be able to drive reforms within the migration space, as well as in other spaces where we require reforms in the continent. So without that a committed will from the administrators, from the securocrats, as Alan called them, as well as from the politicians, we still have a long way to go. So it's important that we strengthen our advocacy work to ensure that the recommendations that come out of our papers, we're able to translate them into effective advocacy instruments for policies that are able to address the issues that have been identified as challenges. On that note, I do want to say thank you very much, and it's been a good afternoon. And now the webinar is closed. We're supposed to close at 16 hours, but we've stolen a little bit of your time, 11 minutes more in terms of my watch, and we apologize for that. But thank you very much. Yep, I think that's all. Unless, Alan, you want to say bye?
Thank you so much for sharing, Yoliswa. Much appreciated. And thanks for everybody for participating in the conversation. And, we've got a few more reports still coming out on migration. And if any of you want more detail, both on what's going on and what we think, could take us forward, please go and have a look at those reports on the nsi.org.za website. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.